The way Luke tells it, this parable is delivered in the house of a Pharisee who'd invited Jesus to come over for dinner on the Sabbath. A person desires to throw a great feast, Jesus says, but one by one, the invitees give excuses as to why they can't attend. I just bought a field, one says, and must attend to that. I just got married, another says, and you know how that is. My father just died, says a third, I must go and bury him, and so on. These excuses make the host upset, so he tells his servants to go out into the city and invite everyone, the poor, the blind, the lame, and so on. For that is what the kingdom of heaven is like. Let us fill these halls, he exclaims. God is merciful, and who in their right mind would want to pass up an invitation like that? Luke's message to his church is mercy. But we're not in the church of St. Luke this morning or today. Instead, we're in the church of St. Matthew. And here, Matthew's church, the message doesn't feel very merciful. With Matthew, instead, the message feels more like judgment. Not only do the invitees reject the king's invitation, some of them are also violent in their rejection. They even mistreat and kill some of the king's servants. And then there's that poor guy at the end. What do we make of him? The king sees him and says, "Friend." It starts out nicely enough, but then continues a little less affably. "How did you get in here without a wedding robe?" And then, as we all know, it continues from bad to worse. This wedding robe non-wearer gets cast out into the darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. He's bound hand and foot. Really? Is Matthew's God about judgment? Where's the mercy? Where's the love? Why can't we be in St. Luke's church today? Now, okay, surely Matthew isn't all judgment. We know this. Surely when Matthew tells the story, there's mercy and love too. I mean, you remember the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit and all that. That's the start of the Sermon on the Mount. That's found in Matthew. There's mercy there. Oh, and the 5,000. Remember the 5,000? He tells the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. That's merciful. And do you remember the healing of 2 blind men? It's a smaller story, but it only shows up in Matthew. They follow after Jesus, shouting, "Son of David, have mercy on us." And so Jesus actually touches their eyes and says, "Let it be done to you according to your faith." And they're healed. There's mercy there. It's only in Matthew's gospel. So yeah, there is mercy for Matthew. There is mercy in Matthew's church, but why not here? Why does the message from today's parable feel more like judgment? Well, let's take a closer look. Now recall from the last few weeks, Jesus is addressing the temple leaders. He's not addressing big crowds of disciples. It's a specific crowd, the temple leaders who have been opposing him. These temple leaders, they were settled and inflexible. They'd established for themselves a religion of control, manipulating often the people, the Jewish people, by means of fear, and I think especially for today, judgment. Common folk were judged by how often or not they were able to make a pilgrimage to the temple. The common folk were judged by whether they could afford a sacrificial animal without blemish or not. The common folk were judged by whether or not they kept 613 commandments. And now today, Jesus is not addressing the common folk, but the leaders of the temple who seat themselves in judgment over the common folk. the temple leaders, they're the ones in the parable who find excuses not to attend. They're the ones who rise up against the king's messengers, prophets like Ezekiel and Amos and John the Baptist, who beat them and even kill them. They're the ones, when they do show up to the wedding feast, they're wearing their own robes, not the wedding robes of the host. So is this it? Is Matthew saying what goes around comes around? That the temple leaders will be judged in the same manner that they judge others? There's one more matter that lies just beneath the surface we want to look at. It's called the historical context. So if we take a step back and we consider this, think about when Matthew penned these words. It was more than a generation after Jesus' death. Something like 40, 45, maybe even 50 years. That's a lot of time. That's enough time for stories about Jesus to develop and circulate around Palestine. Maybe a few of the facts get changed here and there. They percolate. And by this time, communities of disciples had congregated. Each community has its own personality, its own peculiarities. Communities like St. Luke's Church and St. Matthew's Church. And thus, though these communities, they end up telling more or less the same stories, Luke's main point might in fact be a little different than Matthew's main point. Now, the specific community of Matthew was a lot like our congregation today, in a lot of ways. A group of people which bind themselves together about the common life in Jesus Christ, right? A faith in Jesus' message, that his mission would bring salvation to the ends of the earth. But at the same time, Matthew's church was a lot different than our congregation because of its specific historical context. And more to the point, when Matthew penned his version of the old story, I'm sure the destruction of Jerusalem was fresh on his mind. Remember that from our history books? In the year 70 CE or AD, however you want to say it, under orders of Caesar, the Roman military commander Titus went into Jerusalem and completely destroyed it. He razed it. It was especially important to raze the temple. That was the emperor's focus from those rebellious people running it. Roman point of view. You can read about the horrors of this in Josephus. My point for today, though, is that Matthew wrote this parable in hindsight, looking back just a few years later. And I think this hindsight brings a couple of things to light. First, I think his hindsight tells him that, yes, Jesus had been right so long ago, 50 years or whatever it was. He'd been right to confront the temple leaders. He'd been right to challenge the established status quo. And he'd been right in his mission to oppose and topple unjust systems. I think the second thing Matthew's hindsight told him is that God is looking for transformation. God invites all to this wedding feast. It's only those who are unwilling to be transformed. Right? It's only those who come up with excuses or are found not to be wearing the wedding clothes of the host. It's only those who find themselves outside the doors at the end of the day. And surely Matthew cannot help but wonder if these things would have turned out differently if those temple leaders had listened to Jesus on that day. If they had only put on his robes instead of their own, if only they hadn't continued to control and manipulate the Jewish common folk by fear and judgment. If only they hadn't continued to aggravate and frustrate and oppose the Roman leaders provoking Caesar to war, then Jerusalem wouldn't have been destroyed at all. Then no one would have been cast outside into the darkness where there was, among so many other horrors, weeping and gnashing of teeth. So I'm not sure then that Matthew's message is so much judgment as lament. In the very next chapter, Jesus weeps over Jerusalem. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. That doesn't sound like judgment. It sounds like lament. Whatever the case, whether destruction or judgment, in and through it, Matthew offers us consolation today. Because Matthew's church had endured and survived nothing short of a massacre. The temple leaders and the Jewish people had faced the horrors of war. Many of them were killed when Jerusalem fell. It was a tragic day. But many others, those who lived outside of Jerusalem and those who fled the coming destruction, they survived but were dispersed. So now, a generation later, Matthew's church had managed to gather itself together to form a congregation in the fresh aftermath of this destruction. And today, magnificently, he tells us the story of a wedding feast, a lavish table set for anybody and everybody. For both good and bad, he says. For both temple leader and commoner. For both Jew and Gentile. For both rich and poor. We could go on, right? He tells of this lavish table set for anybody and everybody to come to it and be transformed. It's a transforming banquet that arises out of the ashes of a ruined city. So I don't know about you, but I actually am glad we are in Matthew's church today. Because today Matthew reminds us that even in hardships, even when everything around us feels like judgment, even in the midst of actual destruction, Jesus is there inviting us to his lavish banquet table. Will you come to it and allow yourself to be transformed?